Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another event for the Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership. My name is Jordan Howell. I'm the co-director of the center. Today we're very excited to welcome Kathleen Fitzgerald from Conservation Capital. For those of you who are new to events from Rowan Center for Responsible Leadership, our mission is to examine the role of business in society and try to find ways that business can positively impact sustainability issues, conservation issues like what we'll hear about today, and also make positive social impacts, being aware of ethical issues that surround business in the 21st century, and so on and so forth. So Kathleen is our next in a series of excellent speakers that we've had over the last few semesters. By way of a brief introduction, Kathleen is a partner at Conservation Capital and a senior advisor to the World Bank's Global Wildlife Program. She has more than 25 years of experience in integrated large landscape conservation programs in Africa and North America, and served as a vice president to the African Wildlife Foundation for 6 years. Kathleen has helped create new conservation areas, improve the management of existing protected areas, established co-management arrangements covering more than 13 million acres, and designed innovative models for community conservation. She is widely published and has an undergraduate degree in environmental studies and government and a Master of Science degree. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Kathleen. Share with us as much as you like. I'll ask the audience to please post your questions and comments to the chat area. And then however you want to approach it, Kathleen, you can answer questions as they arise, or we can wait till the end, whatever you prefer.
That sounds great. And thanks, Jordan. Why don't, I think waiting until the end would be great. So please absolutely type questions in the chat and look forward to that. What I really hope is I want to spark some discussion and look forward to that engagement. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Why don't I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will work.
We're getting there.
It's thinking.
There we go.
All right, fantastic. Great. I'm just pulling up the chat so that I can see that. Super. Well, again, thank you very much, Jordan, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to speak with you all about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is nature conservation in Africa. And I also see Jack Kelly has joined, which is great. Jack is an intern at Conservation Capital, and we're really delighted to have him as part of the team. So some of the projects that I'm mentioning are some that Jack is helping us with. So thank you for that. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes is introduce you to Conservation Capital. Who are we? What do we do? I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation in Africa, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm going to highlight the status of conservation in Africa. And then what I really want to focus on are some of the solutions that we're seeing and not dwell on the downside, which I think you're probably all aware of. So for starters, Conservation Capital, we are a very small firm, and we were founded about 15 years ago. And our focus is developing financial and business-driven solutions to support the world's most important conservation areas. So what that actually means is helping our partners, our clients, governments, NGOs, private sector, communities, individuals, helping them figure out ways to sustain biodiversity conservation, how to sustain livelihood developments in the rural areas of this world. And our focus has really been about resiliency and diversification. So as you can imagine, when COVID hit, and all of a sudden there was a light bulb moment for many people within our sector about diversifying and developing more resiliency. Suffice it to say, we've been really busy over the last 2 years, and our hope is that what might come out of this terrible 2 years is perhaps systems that are more resilient, because we will see future shocks. And so we've really been spending our time, not just in the last 2 years, last 15 years, thinking about how to create more resilient structures. And my relationship with conservation capital started, gosh, well over 10 years ago when I was at the African Wildlife Foundation. A lot of the business driven solutions that we developed was in partnership with conservation capital. So some of the examples that I will share with you are Conservation Capital African Wildlife Foundation partnerships. So I'm going to jump to Africa. And while conservation capital focuses all over the world, Africa has been my home for the last 15 years. And all the projects that I'm working on right now, except for a few, are in Africa. So I'm going to focus on Africa. And this is one of my favorite maps because it really depicts the scale of the continent, which often surprises everyone. But the bottom line is Africa is a continent of exceptional biodiversity. You know, we support 1/3 of the planet's biodiversity. Our endemism is extraordinary. 1/4 of the planet's mammalian species are in Africa. If you've been paying attention to the dialogue in Glasgow, perhaps you've heard about the Congo Basin, which is in the central part of the continent. And it's the 2nd largest tropical rainforest in the world. So absolutely critical when you think about climate stabilization, as well as carbon sequestration. A majority of the population in Africa are dependent on these natural resources, either directly or indirectly. And that's a key thing, and it's a key thread that cuts through all of the work that we do. And in addition to supporting incredible species, supporting livelihoods and ecosystem services, the natural resources of Africa fuels what we refer to as a wildlife economy. And just by way of example, tourism prior to COVID comprised of almost 9% of our GDP, generating more than 24 million jobs, which is exceptional. And so again, as we think about the future, as we think about how to support conservation, the wildlife economy is absolutely critical to everything that we do. So I'm a map person, and this is kind of a scary map, but it depicts the story of what's happening in Africa, and that is rapid development, rapid impact, increase in population, increase in infrastructure, increase in resource extraction. So the colors that you see here, the red, are the highest human impact areas. So the green are the wild areas that are left. And the challenge again is how to ensure that Africa develops in a way that maintains these important green areas, which again are not just critical for wildlife, they're critical for ecosystem services and the economy of the continent. And the way that we have protected conservation in Africa is mainly through a network of protected areas. And when I say protected areas, I'm referring to government protected areas, private protected areas, as well as community conservation areas. And again, you've probably been hearing a lot about the role of Indigenous communities in conservation over these past 7 days in Glasgow. Africa has an extraordinary network of community conservation areas that protect key habitat, as well as provides employment and revenue to rural communities. So really important areas. Now, our protected area network continues to grow. It's expanded at an extraordinary pace. And there's a call post-2020 to even increase even more, right? There's a call for 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. And that's a great target. The question is, how do we pay for that? How do we sustain that? And how do we make sure that these conservation areas are not just paper parks, right? A green blob on a map which looks good, but it's actually not functional. Again, that's the key challenge. The other key thing I want to point out is in Africa, our protected areas, when we have functioning protected areas, not only do they secure important ecosystem services and wildlife, but they help governments achieve targets. And that's really important in Africa. So here, for example, are Sustainable Development Goals. And, it's probably obvious that a functional protected area will support climate action or life on land or life below water. But what most people don't realize is the extraordinary contribution that functioning protected areas provide to taxes or regional infrastructure or employment. And these are really key things as we try to articulate the value of protected areas to governments in Africa. So the challenge I've alluded to is how do we pay for this, right? And there are two examples on the slide that you can see here. On the left is a paper that I co-authored with some colleagues, and we looked at 282 protected areas that support lions. So we looked at lions as a proxy for ecological health, and we said, well, how much do you need to manage those protected areas well, and how much do we have? And the bottom line is not enough, right? 96% of the range countries that support lions had massive funding deficits. About 94% were funded insufficiently. Only 10 to 20% could actually maintain a budget that would sustainably manage their protected areas. The chart on the right came from the Paulson Institute and the Nature Conservancy and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Biodiversity. It's a mouthful, but this was a report that came out, I believe, this year, if I'm not mistaken. And they looked globally at the biodiversity funding gap, and they came up with a figure of 711 billion per year is required. So we can debate the figures, and there are some good studies out there, but the bottom line is we simply don't have enough to manage our protected areas and to support rural communities effectively. So what this means and what's happening in Africa is a really terrible cycle, right? Because you've got this biodiversity funding gap, which means our protected areas have a lack of capacity. They can't pay rangers. They don't have equipment. They don't have vehicles to do their jobs. So we then get a decline in management effectiveness, and that results in biodiversity loss. And in Africa, what we see as well is a real risk of downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement, right? So you have to justify land use here. And if a conservation area has been set aside and it's not functioning well, it's not providing jobs, it's not supporting biodiversity, a government will degazette it. We saw that a few years ago in Tanzania, for example, with a number of conservation concessions. And the president at the time just said, I'm going to give these to rural communities and they can just, graze and do agriculture. So that's a real risk that we face. And then the final kind of nail in the coffin is that when you have a non-functioning protected area, it's very difficult to attract investment, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Because you would think someone would want to invest in a protected area that needs support. But some of these protected areas, they're just non-functional. So they don't have good governance in place. They don't have the management structure in place. So the cycle just continues and continues. And what we're trying to do is disrupt this cycle. I'm just going to give one example from Kenya where I live, and perhaps you've heard about the great wildebeest migration and extraordinary migration in Africa. But Kenya is an amazing example of a country that has a really robust tourism industry. People come to Kenya, over 1 million, this is pre-COVID, per year to see our wildlife, right? About 8% of the GDP is fueled by tourism revenue. It generates critical jobs for the economy, and yet 50% of our protected areas in Kenya are non-functional. And that's a real challenge, as you can imagine. 61% of the tourism revenue, 61% of our protected areas is financed through tourism, right? So again, when COVID hit, it was quite stressful, as you might imagine, for government protected areas, community protected areas. And again, I want to emphasize the impact on the rural economies is just cataclysmic, because what we find with protected areas is the development that takes place in and around those protected areas provide jobs to rural economies. It's really interesting to look at the demographics of the gender. A majority of the jobs go to women, and that has just an incredible impact on communities. So even a country like Kenya, right, which is seen as a role model country, we have a massive funding deficit every year. And obviously, you can see from these statistics, an over-reliance on wildlife-based tourism. And so it's a challenge. So before I dive into some of the solutions, again, I think it's important to understand where our funding comes from for conservation. And really, there are three funding sources. They're government subsidies. So every government in Africa is providing some level of support for protected areas. There's internally generated revenue. I just mentioned tourism, right? So every time you go into a protected area and you pay an entrance fee, that's internally generated revenue. And lastly, external donations, which provides an enormous amount of support. And external donations from private sector funders, from institutional donors, USAID, for example. It's wonderful, but it's unpredictable and it's fickle. And it's very difficult for a park manager to rely on that long term. The other trend I want to highlight before diving into solutions is this reliance on flagship species and parks. You can see here this mountain gorilla, critically endangered, found in 3 countries in Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC. Uganda and Rwanda, for example, a majority of their revenue is tied to this species. Which obviously is quite risky, because if something happens to that species, your revenue goes with it. Parks, same thing, flagship parks. So Tanzania's protected area state is majorly financed by 2 protected areas, the Serengeti and Kilimanjaro, right? So revenue that comes in for Kilimanjaro supports other protected areas that don't have the benefits of having tourism and other development, which is a good thing, but it's just something as we think about financial solutions to understand this reliance on particular species as well as particular parks. And so when we are advising governments to think about how to improve their resiliency, increase revenue, we always highlight 6 key things. Number 1, understand your gap. And that sounds really basic, but it's not. How much do you really need to manage your protected areas? Number 2 is develop plans and strategies. So most protected areas in Africa don't even have management plans. And I would say a majority do not have business plans. And so if you're approaching a donor or an investor and you have no idea how much you need to actually manage your protected area, it's very difficult to raise the resources. So understand the gap, codify that in a plan, and then really encouraging self-generated revenue to shift the reliance from donor funding, explore innovative finance options, and we'll get into this. And the last 2 are really critical, and they're the least sexy when it comes to conservation and finance, but building an enabling environment is absolutely critical. Having the right policies, regulatory environment to ensure that whatever structures you're setting up are sustainable is critical. Having political leadership is absolutely vital. And the way to build that, the way that we have been building that, is really looking at some of the things that I've highlighted, which are jobs, taxes, how parks secure ecosystem services for rural communities, et cetera. It's unfortunately not about, fuzzy lions. That's not what's going to motivate, for example, the president of Congo. And so really building political leadership is critical. So here's the good news. I'm just trying to get rid of a bar that's on my screen. Give me a second here. Anyway, I'll just try to navigate it. The good news is there are a lot of amazing solutions that are coming out of Africa. And yes, a lot of these solutions are happening globally, but the examples that I'm going to share with you are Africa-based, and they range from conservation trust funds, debt for nature swaps, payment for ecosystem services. There are really cool mitigation and biodiversity offset mechanisms taking place. Management partnerships, which I'll talk about. We've seen green bonds and blue bonds and some great tax incentives. So the great news is there are good solutions coming out of Africa. And what we're trying to do now is scale those up and replicate those at quite a pace. I've mentioned enabling environment, and I usually hammer this point home. But again, before embarking on any of these things, really creating the right environment. What I mean by that is a policy environment that supports these things. I cannot tell you how many times a very cool solution has emerged, and then instantly, with the swipe of a pen, it can be unraveled. And so really, before diving into some of these solutions, making sure that you've got the right environment to support it. So I want to start, and again, I'm just going to give you a smattering of some examples of success that we've seen. And I'm going to start with conservation enterprise, which is really, the basics of developing a business that supports conservation. And this is just one example. And this is happening around Africa, and it's something Conservation Capital has done in a number of places. This is a lodge called Sabinyo Silverback Lodge, and it's located in Rwanda. The lodge itself is wholly owned by the local community. It's managed by a private sector partner. And over the last 10 years, it has generated $3.2 million for the rural economy. So not only changing those people's lives, but also creating just a cadre of conservation supporters. When you go to Rwanda and you meet with these communities, they are the ambassadors for mountain gorilla conservation. They are the reasons why mountain gorillas are seeing an increase. It's an extraordinary success story, and we've done this in a number of places. And what's also really interesting to look at is when COVID hit, having a safety net like the funding that comes out of Sabinyo Silverback Lodge really helped to ensure community resiliency and help them through the COVID. So another example of a solution that is emerging across the continent are collaborative management partnerships. And again, I've highlighted the number of protected areas and the constraints, and just protected area authorities not having the ability to fulfill their management obligations. And what we're seeing are these contractual arrangements between a protected area authority and a partner for the management of a protected area. And, we see this in other sectors, right? We see this with PPPs, for example, in the transportation sector, where government will enter into a PPP with a private sector partner to manage that asset on their behalf. And this is the same, but for protected areas. And I can get into this later if people are interested, but there are different kinds of models. It's not a one size fits all. And we're seeing incredible results. So governments in over 17 countries in Africa have engaged in these partnerships, and they're doing it because they're seeing ecological, economic, technical, and operational success. The chart at the top shows revenue generation from a park in Rwanda, starting from when that management agreement was put in place in 2010, all the way to 2019, so pre-COVID. And as you can see, payments and salaries just shot up. Tax revenues to government shot up. It's incredible. Another example here is Ngorongoro National Park in Zimbabwe, which is also a management agreement between an organization called Frankfurt Zoological Society and the government. The park budget increased by 50% in year one, and now their average budget is around 5 million. So unbelievable success. And I've got this picture here of our Gorongosa, which is a film about Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. The other thing that these partnerships have done is really increase visibility, not only of the protected areas, but of the country, which again helps with development and investment. So looking just at a practical example, this is one of the earliest management agreements, which is between African Parks and Majeti National Park in Malawi. And each of these charts, you can see an increase in community development, an increase in taxes, an increase in budgets, increase in revenue, increase in salaries. So just incredible success. And we're seeing an increase in the uptake across the continent. This just gives you a map, and this was done by the World Bank's Global Wildlife Program, which analyzed 40 collaborative management partnerships, but you can see the spread across the continent. A majority are in Central Africa, followed by Southern. But what's interesting is we analyzed 19 of these, and a majority in the pipeline are in Southern Africa, followed by East Africa. So really great mechanism. And one of the key things that we found is by having this contractual arrangement between government and partner, it creates the right environment for tourism investment, payment for ecosystem service investment, as well as biodiversity offset investment. And so it really catalyzes the investment capital that's coming into these protected areas. Another example is a conservation trust fund. And we're seeing this again across the continent. And essentially what a conservation trust fund is, it's a private, legally independent institution that can be established for a protected area or a protected area estate. And essentially what it is, it's an endowment fund for that protected area or that network. And globally, there are well over 100 conservation trust funds. In Africa, we have well over 24 conservation trust funds. And the way these work is funding comes in from different sources. So you can see on the left, you've got donors, national governments, private sector, NGO. How it's set up is in the middle. So some, as I mentioned, are endowments. Some are sinking funds, which are used to finance different enterprises. And on the right, you can see some of the programs that they support. So direct protected area management, small grants to communities, capacity building. The key thing that we found with conservation trust funds is it enables the protected area authorities and partners to then explore innovative mechanisms. So if you're managing a park and you don't know where you're going to get your salaries the next month paid for, you're not going to be exploring green bonds or payment for ecosystem services. You're simply going to be focused on how to pay your staff. So what we've seen with protected areas that have conservation trust funds, it gives them the flexibility to then pursue different innovative models, which then creates more sustainable mechanisms. So it's a double impact. Now, one example that I want to give you, and Jack, you'll recognize this. This is the BioGuinea Foundation, which is a conservation trust fund that was established for the country of Guinea-Bissau. So Guinea-Bissau is in West Africa, tiny little country. It's protected 26% of the country. And yet it has really none of the traditional funding sources or the ability to develop tourism, et cetera. And so a group of conservationists came together with the government and they created this conservation trust fund, quite visionary. And the idea is to establish $30 million for the conservation estate. Again, it will be invested and the interest will be used to pay the management of the protected area. So that's just one example. And it leads me to yet another opportunity that we're seeing exploding. It's been quite controversial over this last week in Glasgow, and that is REDD, carbon credits. In Guinea-Bissau, for example, these two protected areas that you see are verified for a carbon project. And we are in the process of selling the carbon credits, which will generate well over $2.5 million for the protected area estate. Some of that money will go into the endowment to support those protected areas long-term, and the others will go into community development projects and forest conservation projects. REDD it's expanding across the continent. When you think about the Congo Basin, it's an extraordinary opportunity to generate funding to support the conservation of those forests. And again, it's a topical issue. So investment, that's something else we're seeing increase around the continent. There's a lot of talk about green investment. And I want to give you one example of a fund that we created, which is called Umiliki. A very small fund, it was $7 million. And we use this fund to invest in enterprises. 50% were agriculture, 50% were tourism. The investment was driven to support those businesses, expand those businesses. And in exchange, those businesses, not only did they pay the fund back, but they agreed to certain conservation and social criteria. So for example, this is the Grootberg Lodge in Namibia, which is a community conservancy. The lodge is wholly owned by the community, managed by a private sector partner. They took a loan from Umiliki, and in exchange, they agreed to certain covenants around black rhinos, as well as upholding social standards for employees and local communities. So all these arrangements that we come up with are quid pro quo, providing finance, providing investment in exchange for conservation and social outcomes. Impact bonds, so related to investment, and we are seeing across Africa a number of impact bonds, and I'm going to highlight one of them, and that is the Rhino Impact Bond, which this was an article in the Financial Times. And this was a bond that we supported the development of, and knock on wood, it should be launched this year, which would be fantastic. But essentially, you know, black rhinos critically endangered, their population has plummeted to well below 6,000. And it's been driven, I'm sure you're aware, by poaching. And obviously linked to protected area management. If you don't have resources, if your rangers don't have equipment, you simply can't protect the rhinos. And what we found was there were a couple of drivers in addition to poaching. So we found that there was a lot of funding coming in for rhinos, but it wasn't turning the population numbers around. We found that a lot of the funding was short-term, and it lacked the ability for managers to adaptive management. So, you know, with the poaching crisis, the need to be nimble and to adapt was absolutely critical. And again, just increased funding gap. So the idea with the Rhino Impact Bond, again, this would be a whole other conversation, but essentially to attract investment. So investors would come in and their return was pegged on the growth rate of black rhinos. And again, very complicated, yet pretty straightforward. So rather than following the stock market, we wanted you to follow the growth of an endangered species. And if the species grew to a certain extent, a percentage per year, which was based on rigorous science, the rhino specialist group was involved with this, then you would get a return on your investment. The idea was really to bring in new capital and also to shift the risk. So right now, a lot of the risk in conservation falls on the shoulders of donors, right? So they provide a grant. Sometimes objectives are achieved and sometimes not. The investors coming in would actually finance the implementation on the ground. And if there was success, they would get paid back. But if not, they would get a deduction in their payback. So it was an interesting model trying to shift, again, risk and to bring in new capital and to add a rigor of evaluation. So one of the key things, I've mentioned the funding gap. The other key thing that we often focus on is how do you use the resources we have more wisely? And with rhino conservation, what's interesting is a lot of the funders will measure success by the inputs. So tell me, how many boots did you buy? Or how many rangers went out last month? And with this model, we said, we don't care how many boots you buy. We don't care how many rangers go out. I'm obviously being flip. We care how many rhinos you grew. Did the population increase? So really focusing on the output and shifting how we evaluate conservation success. Lastly, and this is my last example, we are seeing an increase in biodiversity offsets. Now you remember that scary map I showed you of the human footprint in Africa. We are seeing rapid development, rapid resource extraction. It is happening. And what we're trying to do is design plans to ensure that development happens in a way that's positive for communities, positive for the environment. And one of the tools being used are biodiversity offsets. And essentially what this means is following what's called the mitigation hierarchy. So whenever you go in and develop something, your first goal should be to not have an impact. But as you know, if you've seen a large mine or a 6-lane highway, there's going to be an impact. So what the mitigation hierarchy does is it really looks at how to minimize impact, how to reduce adverse impact, and where necessary, where there is going to be an impact, how to offset that to a no net loss or a net gain. And we see this in North America, for example, in the United States with wetlands. So you're very familiar with this. If you're going to develop a wetland, how do you restore and or replace that wetland? Quite controversial. And just one example that we were involved with is Niokolo-Koba National Park in Senegal, so another country in West Africa. Niokolo-Koba National Park, it's located in the southeast part. And there's a gold mine outside of the protected area that was having an impact. And they entered into a biodiversity offset. Now, they did that not because the government of Senegal required it. In fact, many governments in Africa do not. But this is a company from Australia. Their shareholders demanded it, or their customers demanded it. And so they engaged in an offset, which is now financing conservation management of the protected area. So again, we're seeing this across the continent. And one of the key things is if there's funding available from the offset to achieve a conservation outcome, the key challenge is if you don't have the management structure in place to do that, then you really can't operationalize that offset. So again, creating the right structures so that funding can come in and it can be used to achieve an outcome. So that was a lot on different solutions and challenges, but I hope it gives you just an idea of some of the creativity that's taking place across the continent. It's pretty exciting. The challenges are daunting, but the innovation is very exciting. So I will end there. Thank you for your attention. And I see there's some great questions coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathleen. We're all clapping for you in this virtual way. I think we can give you like a clapping hand emoji here so that you feel, a round of applause. Yeah, and
Thank
lots of
you.
interesting questions, and I'm sure that there will be some more along the way. There was some kind of facty type of questions that hopefully you can answer. Can you tell us what are the key differences between a functional and a non-functional protected area? I'm sure we could guess, but we'd rather hear from you.
Yeah, so when I say a non-functional protected area, gosh, it can mean a bunch of things. So let's start with functional. A functional protected area is one that is managed, and it's managed well. And that you can unpack that. But what I mean by that is it has the right team on the ground to be able to manage that park. And management in Africa, I mean, it varies depending on where you're located. But for example, anti-poaching teams is the key thing. A non-functional protected area is one I would define as not being able to achieve its conservation objectives. Mm-hmm. So for example, I mentioned in Kenya, some of the non-functional protected areas have been set aside for particular species, plant species, mammalian species. And because they're not managing the protected areas, there's incursion by livestock, by agricultural expansion. And so the species that they set that protected area aside for are either no longer there or their numbers have gone down. So I hope that explains it. There are some really interesting tools for actually measuring management effectiveness in Africa.
Sure. Okay. All right. So that's a good place to start. There are a few questions about the kind of tourism industry, I guess, in these situations. Do you have any idea of the breakdown between foreign and domestic tourism into protected areas? I guess, non-Africans, maybe international travelers, but people from elsewhere in Africa versus folks from inside a country?
Yeah, really, really great and relevant question. And it depends on where you are. So for example, Southern Africa has a robust domestic tourism market, right? Self-drive, for example, from South Africa into Zimbabwe and Botswana and Namibia is quite common. East Africa is reliant upon the international tourism market. And so again, when COVID hit, that faucet turned off overnight. And what it has forced governments to do is look at the blend and the importance of blending domestic and international tourism. I live on a conservancy, it's 100,000 acres. And they have international as well as domestic tourism. And so were they hit by COVID? Yes. But were they hit as hard as the places that only relied on long haul travel? No. Sure. And obviously, creating political support for conservation, as I mentioned, is absolutely vital. And by making your protected areas open and accessible to domestic tourism, not only are you helping to diversify your revenue sources, but you're creating support for conservation, which is absolutely vital.
Yeah. Is there the same attitude towards national parks and these types of preserves as you in Africa and African countries as you find in the US? I don't know if you're able to answer that question, but one thing Americans still agree on is that they love national parks and they see a value to having them.
Yeah, it depends where you are.
Okay.
I know that's a wishy-washy answer, but if you are a cattle keeper outside of Amboseli National Park and your cow is just mauled by a lion, you're definitely not going to be expressing support for that protected area.
Sure.
And again, if you look at the protected area state, a a lot of protected areas are wet areas, right? Because that's where you have high biodiversity. So add climate change here, and we're seeing a decrease in water, a decrease in access to water, and we're seeing more conflict. And so there's increased animosity towards protected areas because, hey, that water in there we need for our agriculture or we need for our livestock.
Yeah.
On the flip side, if you go to certain urban areas, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Kigali, there's pride. There's incredible pride. I mean, in Rwanda, every year they have a gorilla naming ceremony. It's the only country in the world that has that. And they invite celebrities from all over the world, Sean Penn, Kofi Annan, who come and they get to name a new gorilla. And it's extraordinary. And so there is this amazing pride in the species that Africa has, which frankly, nowhere else in the world can compare. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And some of those conflict issues sound like, things that you might see in the US or you have where there was an issue over wolves and livestock around US parks and increasingly, like you mentioned with the water access, why preserve this wetland when California is turning into a giant desert and so on and so forth. So, totally different context, but some of the same kind of underlying concerns.
Right.
Another question about tourism: are the jobs that are generated by protected areas, are they primarily in this tourism sector, land protection activities, or are there other types of employment that come along with protected areas?
So obviously the direct jobs, as you mentioned, rangers, and I saw a question about women. The majority of rangers in Africa are males.
Sure.
That is changing. It's actually really cool. Some of the women rangers in Zimbabwe, for example, they're able to get information about poaching that their male counterparts cannot. So it's kind of cool, these dynamics and relationships within the local communities that these women are able to tap into. It's great. So ranger jobs, management jobs, yes, then tourism jobs ranging from, safari guides all the way to managers of lodges.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the spin-off businesses, right? So for example, the farmers that provide the food to those tourism lodges. There's an unbelievable innovation around some of these spin-off businesses that employ a lot of people and provide revenue to local communities. So again, when COVID hit, people thought, oh, well, it's just the people employed in those lodges. Absolutely not. Think about, again, Kenya. People come and they spend a couple of nights in Nairobi. People in Nairobi were hit by this because of that. So there's a whole string of employment and revenue that comes into citizens.
Sure. Yeah. If you're going to go from a long haul place, you're going to be there for some time and maybe not just in the wilderness areas. Questions about some of the financing mechanisms that exist and that conservation capital is involved in. For a fund like Umaliki that you mentioned, who are the typical investors into that fund? Are they open to the public? Can we invest? Are they very sort of selective? How does that work?
So that's a really great question. Umaliki was developed with the African Wildlife Foundation, and it was really kind of friends and family of AWF. So members, trustees, and the investment size of Umaliki ranged from approximately $250,000 to $2.5 million.
Okay.
And that to us is the sweet spot. And quite frankly, that's a challenge because we're hearing a lot about this green wall of funding and all this money coming into conservation. And what we've been told is you've got to go big. You've got to go to 100 million, for example. The challenge with a project of that size is finding projects to finance that are going to have that impact. And so that's really what we wrestle with, with these deals that we did with Umaliki. There was direct impact to communities, direct impact to conservation. Certainly when you're talking about energy, when you're talking about solar, you can do those large deals. And we are seeing that in Africa, which is great. And we need to see more of that. In terms of kind of these boutique investments that I'm talking about, it's a challenge finding the funding. Now, the other debate as well is, okay, well, what's the return?
Yeah.
And obviously, well, not obviously, I shouldn't say that. Investment in Africa is risky, number one. Number two, you're not going to generate a 12% return from a tourism lodge in Ethiopia. In fact, we invested in 2 lodges in Ethiopia, which, if you've looked at the news right now, the country is locked down. So there's no return on investment right now. But again, we were looking at like a 1 to 3% return. So these are for individuals who had patient capital, right, and were keen to see a conservation outcome. They didn't want to give the money away. They wanted to see the return of their capital plus a little bit of interest.
Sure. So not yet can we as individuals open up our Robinhood apps and invest in a fund like Umaliki?
Not yet. And, the Rhino Impact Bond, that was something, I saw someone's question, what was our role? That really was our vision long term. How cool would it be to open that up? And Elizabeth Haddock could put in $100 and track that rhino population and see how her funding was going. Yeah. That's really what we're looking for. But I think we're a little ways off. I don't know of any examples. You might, Jordan, but I don't.
I can't think of one that operates at the level of like a retail investor, but just focusing on the US, people will open their wallets to protect animals in the US. We love animals more than any other country, followed by like South Korea or something like that. And you have to think with the donations that go to something like World Wildlife Fund every year from the US or Oxfam or and similar types of organizations, that you could raise capital that way.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
For the finance nerds like myself that are attending this talk, this all sounds eerily similar to the kind of flood of capital that you saw around venture capital projects, these things called SPACs recently, where there's so much money just sitting there looking for an investment that you can't find enough projects to invest in. So
Right.
It's interesting that, Kathleen, you mentioned that there's this huge funding gap on the one hand for protected areas, and on the other hand, there's capital searching for projects. And so that's a market failure of a textbook, sense. And so wondering, well, how do you actually bridge that gap? That's such an interesting question, and one that clearly, as your explanation of conservation capital's projects is showing, I mean, if you can bridge that gap, you do excellent work. It's just putting the two things together, and doing so is quite tricky, it turns out. Ryan had an interesting multi-part question here about the impact of this investment on kind of local economics, I guess. So the first part, will trusts and endowments lose their effectiveness over time as local economies increase? I'm not sure what exactly that's in reference to, other than maybe what is the scope for local fundraising, I guess, local investment into these protected areas. And then is there a risk of overinvestment in these communities, something like inflation or something like, a boom and bust kind of cycle? Maybe if we invest too heavily in tourism or too heavily in protected areas, Are there any risks that we've seen, that could pop up?
Yeah, lots of risks. So I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly, but tourism is a good example, right? So we've seen incredible success with tourism. And so surely more tourism means more conservation, right? Absolutely not. And that's the challenge that we face. So for example, the wildebeest migration that I mentioned in Kenya, that reserve, the Masai Mara Reserve, that ecosystem, there are about 180 lodges in that ecosystem, far too many, right?
Mm.
So what we're seeing, 2 months ago, there was an article that came out about tourism not only impacting the landscape, but impacting wildlife behavior. So there are risks. And that's when I go back to my little soapbox on enabling environments. When we were, for example, we were invited to Ethiopia by the government, and they said, we want you to help us build lodges. And we said, no, we're not going to do that until you have a good tourism plan, until you have a good strategy to attract the right investors, and until you have a good framework for how the money is spent, right? So there's increasing revenue, but if there isn't a good strategy for how that revenue is going to be spent, and we see this all the time, for example, in community conservancies, where if there's elite capture, well, then the rest of the community doesn't benefit, and they are not going to be ambassadors for conservation. So there are lots of risks throughout. I think, Ryan, to the first part of your question, in terms of the endowments and losing effectiveness, this is a challenge in terms of, so the BioGuinea Foundation, which I mentioned, they calculated how much they would need based on a certain return, and also how much money they would need to actually manage the fund. And so it really takes a lot of planning in advance to figure out how much you need over time to support those conservation areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the ongoing COP26. If you read the headlines most of the day, it's a commentary on we need X billions of dollars to achieve the outcome we want. But as you're explaining this, it's clearly more than just a problem of that you can throw money at. You can throw a lot of money at a lot of environmental problems, and you're basically lighting it on fire. Because, what is the impact? Well, you might be contributing to inequality in a place if you don't do it well, or you protect the wrong types of things, you protect the wrong landscapes, or maybe folks are looking for something that protects the livelihood through ecosystem services as opposed to a wildlife preserve of the type you're describing.
Right.
So it has to be
Absolutely.
smart money that's, people that are carefully kind of studying this. Kathleen, if we can ask, on that note, how did you get into this line of work? And for students who are maybe interested in this type of thing, what would you recommend to them? How can they get involved in something like the work you're doing or with a firm like Conservation Capital?
So my interest in conservation came, since I was little. And I'm fortunate, as an undergraduate, I went to St. Lawrence University. I knew exactly what I wanted to study. So I studied environmental studies and did government as a minor. And I spent a semester in Africa studying animal ecology. And then when I got out of university, I worked for a conservation journal, which blended conservation biology and activism. And I reached a point where I felt like I needed a master's degree to learn science.
Mm.
And I had the privilege of participating in a program at the University of Vermont, which focused on translating science into policy and reality. So giving you enough science so that you could then influence change with that. And yeah, in terms of, for students that are looking into conservation right now, it's such a broad field, right? There's pesticides and pollution and wildlife and climate change. And I'd say number one, think about what you're passionate about. I mean, I've always been passionate about wildlife, so my path was very clear. But think about what you're passionate about. Think about the scale you want to have an impact. There are amazing. I used to work at a land trust in the northeastern United States, and that was a very local conservation impact, and it was very rewarding. My work now is much more large scale. And so think about the scale that you want to have an impact. And then I always think about where I can have the greatest impact at this time, right? And the issues that I see as extremely relevant, and this is not going to surprise you. Number one is climate change. It's impacting everything that we do. I think there's a lot of opportunity around innovative finance. I really do, because grant finance is just not, it hasn't been doing it for 50 years, and I don't see that changing. So if you are interested in conservation and finance, I think there's a huge opportunity there. And the last thing I would say is get out there and get some practical experience. That to me, when I graduated, I had an internship, I worked for peanuts, but that real practical experience is so valuable.
Yeah, a related question. What about, is it possible to work in the policy and legislative sphere coming from a science background, as opposed to the approach that you take starting with the kind of political and government and then moving to the science?
Yeah, I think so, because the policies that are relevant, you need to understand how these systems function, right? And so having that background gives you the credibility to be able to influence policy. Likewise, again, I go back to having practical experience. When I'm meeting with a minister, I can point to, when I did this project in the field, or when I was with this community, it just gives you credibility as opposed to, hey, I read about this, and this would be something you should try. I mean, they're just going to dismiss you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Great advice. And we could listen to you talk all day about your work, Kathleen, but we know you have other things to do out there in Kenya, and different time zone as well. So very different time zone. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll certainly be in touch, and we hope we can have you back sometime in person or again via Zoom, whatever is best for you. Thank you so much.
Well, that'd be great, Jordan. And thanks everyone for your interest and great questions.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Thanks.